I'm Alex. I'm 20 years old. Right now I live in Austin, Texas, but I've lived all over. And the reason that I've lived all over is because I was in several places in something that's called the troubled teen industry. And I'm going to be talking about that today. I'm also trans, and I'm going to be talking about how my queer journey was impacted by the troubled teen industry. So I had dropped out of school and I was just so depressed. I was using drugs at the time, and so my mental state was very all over the place, and I really didn't have the motivation to do anything. And there was something that I was looking forward to was a concert that I had gotten tickets for a few months prior for my birthday. I was going to see Avril Lavigne in concert, and last minute, the friend that I was supposed to go with canceled on me. And I think a lot of stuff had been building up, and I was really looking forward to that show, so that was like a trigger for me. And I started just kind of having an emotional meltdown and kept telling my parents I needed to go outside and take a walk, but they didn't want me to do that because they thought something might happen to me, so they were restraining me, and it was just escalating the situation. So then I did eventually escape, and I got out the door and I ran to Safeway, which is a grocery store near where I live, and I got cough syrup and I drank 3 bottles of it because I knew that that's how much you needed in order to OD. So I later found out that I had BPD, and that's kind of why things like that happen. I'll get in these moods where I'm so stressed out and I feel like there's no other way out, and I get suicidal, but usually the mood passes within an hour. So within an hour, I was back at my house. I was apologizing to my mom, and I told her, "Hey mom, I drank 3 bottles of cough syrup and I'm probably gonna OD." The cough syrup takes like 2 hours to kick in, so nothing had happened yet. So we went to the hospital, and I don't really remember anything about that, but because it was an attempt and because I was a minor at the time, they made me stay in the psych ward for a week afterwards. And that's when my parents were really concerned, and they talked to the people at the hospital, and they also talked to somebody called an educational consultant about next steps for me, and they made a whole plan for me to be sent to Wilderness without my knowledge at all. I thought I would be going home after the psych ward. From the psych ward, I went directly to Wilderness. My parents told me I was going to a rehab in Colorado and that it would be kind of like sleepaway camp. We would stay in cabins and do activities, but there would also be a therapeutic aspect. They weren't lying to me, my parents. This is truly what they believed because they didn't have time to go tour this place. I was in the psych ward. They looked at the website. From the psych ward, I went directly to Wilderness. My parents told me I was going to a rehab in Colorado and that it would be kind of like sleepaway camp. We would stay in cabins and do activities, but there would also be a therapeutic aspect. They weren't lying to me, my parents. This is truly what they believed because they didn't have time to go tour this place. I was in the psych ward. And my mom is very into like yoga and spirituality, and they said, "Oh, we do yoga and meditation here," and she was really excited for me to get help, and I was really wanting to get help too because I was struggling and I didn't want to keep struggling. But it wasn't until I got there that I found out there was no cabins, no toilets. It was legitimately in the middle of the woods, no tents, just a sleeping bag and a tarp. It was nothing like what I expected. I also thought, my parents thought that it was in Colorado and that is where the office was, but the camp itself is actually in Utah. That's another thing I was disappointed about. My attempt happened in October and I got sent away right then, like October, November. It was snowing in Utah, it was freezing, and I do not do well in the cold. I remember the first few nights I got there, I wrote my dad a 9-page letter detailing like all of the terrible things that they were making us do. I had just OD'd, I was 80 pounds, and we were hiking 8 to 10 miles a day, sometimes 2 or 3 miles. We were hiking every single day. I had a backpack that weighed more than me, and I have permanent shoulder and back damage from carrying that backpack around. And the food, I didn't like the food very much, but you had to eat or else you needed like energy. And I was not a fast eater, and I needed to eat very slow, but you couldn't get seconds. Like there was never enough seconds for everybody. So if you didn't eat fast enough, you weren't going to get full. And another thing with food is we were given a certain ration of food that we had to ration for ourselves for breakfast and lunch each week. And if you ate all your food in the beginning, you were screwed. You had no more food, and we weren't allowed to share food for some reason. Dinners we would do together, and how they did that was someone would go, a staff member, and drop like food and water barrels at what was called a drop point, and we would hike from drop point to drop point. And if we didn't make it, or some kid refused to hike, we wouldn't get food or water until we made it to the drop point. So there was a lot of people will ask me, why didn't you just refuse to hike? And because refusing to hike would have hurt my team. And I cared about all those girls that I was there with, because, you know, you get really close to people really fast when you're going through a traumatic experience together. And so I hiked not because I enjoyed it, but because I didn't want to hurt other people. And that's also a way that they would get you to guilt trip you, is if you were refusing to hike, they would have the whole team come around you and say how it made them feel that you weren't hiking. So they would say, I feel sad that you're stopping us from hiking because blah, 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 and essentially shame and guilt them into hiking. And it worked like 100% of the time. It was a wilderness therapy program. They're also known as outdoor behavioral programs, but what I actually believe they should be called is boot camp or ranger school, because I mentioned earlier that I wrote my dad a 9-page letter about it, and he responded back, this sounds like Army Ranger School, because my dad did Army Ranger School. I had just turned 17 like a few weeks before. And the thing about these camps is it's like boot camp, but a lot of the kids that are sent there aren't delinquents. It's not like that. A lot of them are just depressed or like stopped going to school. A lot of them are there for eating disorders. I would consider myself kind of a delinquent, because I dropped out of school and I was using substances, but I was doing also a lot of like normal teenage behavior that I ended up getting extremely shamed for when I was there. One of the first therapy exercises that they had the parents and myself do was they had my parents write down every single thing that they could remember that I'd ever done that hurt them. And then I had to read that letter to the whole group. Like I was crying the whole time, and then I had to write a letter not explaining why I did those things, because that's excuses and justification. I wasn't allowed to use any sort of justifying phrases, but I was supposed to say, I acknowledge each thing that my mother wrote down that I did to her, and say, I take accountability, it was all my fault. You know, in more recent therapy that I've gotten that's been good, I learned that, yeah, I was a bad kid, but a lot of the things that I did were out of a reaction, like to something that I didn't know how to handle. And I was just copying a lot of like how my parents reacted in situations, because of how just sick I felt all the time and how difficult it was on my body. I thought that I was gonna die there. I was suicidal. I would fantasize about, okay, tomorrow I'm gonna go jump off whatever cliff we're hiking because I can't take this anymore. It was like the most suicidal that I've ever been in my life. And coming out of wilderness, I would wake up in excruciating pain in my back. And now I go to a chiropractor like once every few months, and they inject tramadol into certain spots of my back, which is a painkiller, because I have like permanent chronic back pain from my experience there. And at that same wilderness, I got a UTI because they told us wipe with leaves. I got a UTI and I told them that I had one, and they never tested it. They never took me for testing. They never gave me any antibiotics. And by the time I got out of wilderness, I had a kidney infection, which was much more severe. And then I had to get that treated. And now I'm very prone to getting UTIs all the time because of that. So there's like the trauma that stayed with me, but there's also like very real physical consequences that will continue to affect me for the rest of my life. I definitely felt a lot of resentment towards my parents because I believed that this is what they thought that I deserved. for me behaving badly. And then they got so brainwashed by the treatments. So the treatments say, you know, we're not going to fix your kid if you don't fully trust us, which is manipulation. And so I did manage to tell my mom, like, I think we're being abused here. They're hurting us. And they managed to tell my mom that I was manipulating her and that all kids do this. And I was just a bad kid and I was just trying to get what I want. And so I at first felt a lot of anger, and then I realized how much my parents were manipulated by this program. And my mom still doesn't really trust me to this day. I think it was so ingrained in her that my whole life and all of the reasons and things that I had struggles with growing up were me manipulating her and not. She had no part in it. My dad since then has apologized, and he said he wishes he would have come got me, and he's apologized for sending me there. But my mom, she doesn't really even like to think about it. I think it kind of saddens her, and she doesn't want to admit that she did that to me technically, even though I do understand that it wasn't her fault. And my parents were trying to do the best that they could do for me. They said, you know, to try to get me the best in the country because that's what they claim they are. I just felt really isolated and alone, and I never ended up going home, which is the sad part, because the thing that kept me going through treatment was, okay, like, if I can make it through this treatment, just do what they say, then I'll get to go home. But they kept saying, surprise, you're going to another one after this. So I was very desperate to leave Wilderness the first time because it was, in my head, the worst thing that I'd ever gone through. And it was at the time before I went to the other treatments. But, and in order to get kicked out, I tried to run away multiple times. And I thought maybe, I was kind of delusional. I thought maybe I could run somewhere and just stay like on the streets of the closest town that I found out. There was nothing for 10 miles. I walked for 15 miles and the last time that I ran away, and I got to one lady's house and they weren't even home, and I had gotten frostbite on my toes and fingers at that point, so I had to go back. And then eventually I was so happy to be getting kicked out. I was like, any psych ward, anything would be better than this. If it's inside and has a toilet, like, it would be better than this. And I really loved nature, and I think that's one of the reasons my mom was really excited about wilderness therapy for me. But now, if I go on like a hike or something and we get too far away from houses or I can't see trees, I get panic attacks. That was when I went to my therapeutic boarding school, Uinta Academy. Therapeutic boarding schools are what wilderness feeds into. And they're not really boarding schools, they are treatment centers, like residential treatment centers. And actually at Uinta Academy, I experienced the most abuse that I experienced out of all of the inpatient experiences I had in the troubled teen industry. And I was there for 8 months, and I ended up getting kicked out for a sexual assault that they blamed on me. Got sexually assaulted there by a girl who was much younger than me, but she was taller than me and about 100 pounds heavier. And she assaulted me in the middle of the night, and I reported it the next morning. And the staff blatantly said to my face, well, you knew better because you were 17 and she was 14. It couldn't have been her fault. And so they kicked me out for raping somebody, even though I didn't do that. And I had to talk to the police and talk to social workers. And after hearing my story, they didn't even go to court. Like, I didn't even need a lawyer because it was very obviously not my fault. And Uinta was very, very like homophobic. I did have a consensual sexual relationship with somebody there, and they gave us the most harshest punishments that the treatment center had, and they put us on no contact, where like we couldn't speak to each other for the rest of the time that I was there. We couldn't pass notes. If we were caught making eye contact or being within 5 feet of the other person, we would get in trouble, and that's hard to do in a house full of 16 people. And after that, they added a lot of restrictions to my treatment plan. So I couldn't sit on the floor anymore. I had to sit in an individual chair. I couldn't be alone with another girl in the room without a staff. We weren't allowed to talk about sexuality or anything like that. And this was not a conversion camp. My mom knew that I was gay, and she supported me. She wanted me to go somewhere that was inclusive, and on their website it says we're inclusive of LGBTQ people. and we'll have groups and discuss things with them. And they did none of that. And if you were trans even like before, they would call you by your dead name and use she, her pronouns for you. And the whole experience of just like people not being allowed to be around me or touch me just made me feel so disgusting about myself. And it just enforced the idea that I was a bad person and that I deserved all of this treatment that was happening to me, because that's what they told me. You know, at Uenta, we would have therapy sessions where we would break down everything that we did and everything that happened to us, like our trauma, and see what we could have done differently in that situation. So like victim blaming, like, so you got assaulted, what could you have done differently to prevent that? If you told your therapist you did something like self-harm or that you were having urges, they would put you on restrictions or they would get you in trouble for it. So you really couldn't do therapy and be honest with your therapist because you just desperately wanted to get out of there. After leaving that treatment, I truly believed that maybe I did assault somebody and maybe I am like a bad person, and it made me much more suicidal and just more upset. But talking it through with therapists and people afterwards made me realize like what happened. They told our parents we would be fixed when we left, and that's not how therapy works. Therapy, you learn to cope better, but a lot of the kids that had mental disorders, their disorders didn't just go away, and they won't. They needed to be taught coping skills, and we were not taught coping skills. We were taught to push it way back into our minds and to put on a mask and pretend that everything was fine. And that's another reason that most kids that come out of the TTI end up doing worse in life than when they went in. So I left in 2019 in the fall, and then I left again in 2020 in around Thanksgiving. And then so 2 years in the troubled teen industry, and then after that I did another year in different adult rehabs. So at the therapeutic boarding school, they had horses and did equine therapy, which actually is very beneficial and like can be great for people, but the horses were essentially abused, and like we were in charge of taking care of our horse. Depressed kids who couldn't even take care of themselves, and it was just dangerous. Like girls ended up getting hurt by the horses. We would have to feed them every day, and like we would get blamed for anything bad that ever happened to the horses. And they were essentially living in 6 foot deep like piles of their own feces, and a lot of them were really sickly, and they would die kind of unexpectedly. Another thing that they did there was something called body checks. Even if you didn't struggle with self-harm, a staff could just say, I suspect you of self-harming, and perform a body check on you, which is where you would get completely naked and turn around in front of staff. And they would mark on a little piece of paper where you had marks or self-harm or tattoos or anything like that. And they could do it at any random time that they wanted, and it was just really humiliating. One of the reasons that the place, I think, was super homophobic also was because it was run by Mormons, and all of the staff that worked there were Mormon, and they said it was inclusive, but it just like went against a lot of their values. And so when they would meet as a team and decide your punishment for being a homosexual, all of the Mormons would be making a decision, and in their culture it's like very bad to be gay. And that's another thing about the toxic femininity, is in their culture, like females have a certain job, and that's kind of what they were trying to like teach us. Because when I was there, I was living in a constant trauma response, like survival mode. I couldn't think about myself. And when I finally got out, I started healing and thinking about myself. And that's when I came out as trans officially and started my transition. When I finally was like out of treatment, I was living on my own. For the first time ever, I was selfish and started to look at myself, because I had just been in straight survival mode, and I had been doing drugs also before, and I was sober, clear-headed, and I remembered feelings that I had as a kid about dreaming to be a boy. I saw things about trans guys, and I did a lot of research, and I was already a lesbian at the time. I identified as a pretty masculine presenting lesbian. But like before that, like my girlfriend that passed away, we would talk about it. And I think that if she had lived longer, she might have been trans too. We would talk about how like being a boy would be so much better and we just wish we were boys, but transitioning is just too much effort and we're too depressed for that. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't super depressed. And so I got to go through self-discovery and I came out as trans. And a lot of my family was really supportive, but my mom was not. She wanted me to go talk to another therapist, and I just kind of cut off my communication with her because that was just kind of my last straw. Because when I first told her that I was trans, she said, "No, you aren't." When I told her I was being abused in treatment, she said, "No, you're not." When I told her I got assaulted, she said, "No, you didn't." She's just never believed anything that I say. And so that was like the tip of the iceberg for me. And I don't really talk to her anymore. But apart from that, like it went really well. And I ended up having to go back into an inpatient place for adults, but I was treated with so much respect. They asked me about my pronouns. They never called me by my dead name. They didn't reveal my dead name to any of the other patients. They asked me what I was comfortable with, what I was safe with. And the thing is, I live in Texas, and I was treated this positively as a trans person in a mental health facility in Texas, and therapeutic boarding school for children that claims to help them and claims to be a safe haven for LGBT kids that are struggling, abuses them and shames them for it. I mean, the best way for me to process is to talk about it, and talking about it in therapy, telling the stories to my friends, and talking about it on the internet has been the most therapeutic for me. And for a really long time, I just felt like such a victim and I felt so helpless. And now I've realized that by sharing my story and by talking about it, I might be able to help other people. I've had parents reach out to me and say "Hey, I watched your video and I was considering sending my kid here, but I don't think I'm gonna do that anymore." And I was like, wow, that's a really special impact to have on somebody. And I didn't know how I could cope through it, and I still struggle to cope with the trauma. And for some people, they just want to push it away and try to forget about it. And if that works for you, do that. But honestly, talking about it has been helping me so much. And I was so depressed and I didn't feel like I had much of a purpose in life, but I've kind of turned it into my purpose to help kids not have to go there or to shut these places down. Or I'm studying psychology so that I could be a counselor. I think just find a way to turn it into something good, because you're so strong for being a survivor.